Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, Holly Kuzmich.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to host this debate tonight. This is the fourth in a series convened by the Brookings Institution and the Charles Koch Institute in partnership with Politico. And I also want to thank our friends, the Center for Presidential History at SMU and the World Affairs Council of Dallas and Fort Worth. This series is crossing the country, looking to expand the conversation on crucial foreign policy issues confronting our country. And when they chose Dallas, they selected a city that's a vibrant economic hub, a cultural crossroads, a magnet for education with universities like SMU, and home to a unique institution like the Bush Center. Here at the Bush Center, we tackle our own set of foreign policy issues with the work we do through the Bush Institute. For example, through our work on human freedom and democracy, we're providing thought leadership on North Korean human rights. We train young leaders in a country like Burma that's a transitioning democracy. In fact, we're currently at work on a public opinion research project and national poll with our two partners, Freedom House and the Penn Biden Center, to understand what Americans think about democracy in this country and what's behind their declining lack of faith in institutions. That polling will be out in just about 6 weeks, so look for that coming your way. Through our Women's Initiative, we're working with women in the Middle East and North Africa and Afghanistan to help them improve their leadership skills. And through our work on global health, we advocate for the continued support of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa. And we're now working to tackle cervical cancer on that continent. Women with HIV are 5 times more likely to get cervical cancer. It's a disease that's easily preventable and treatable, and so we're working to increase their capacity. When I thought about the topic at hand tonight, I thought there's not a dearth of issues to be talking about tonight in terms of foreign policy. So it's a privilege to have you all here tonight with us in person, and for those of you watching online, and to engage in this timely conversation. And now I want to turn the stage over to Greg Hellman, who is the defense reporter and author of Morning Defense for Politico. Please welcome Greg.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the fourth debate on America's changing role in the world, convened by the Brookings Institution and Charles Koch Institute in partnership with Politico. I'm Greg Hellman, defense reporter with Politico and author of the Morning Defense newsletter, and it's a pleasure to be here in Dallas for tonight's debate, co-hosted by the Center for Presidential History at SMU, the World Affairs Council of Dallas and Fort Worth, and of course, the George W. Bush Presidential Center, without which this evening's spectacular venue would not be possible. Thank you, Holly, for opening tonight's event, and thank you to our audience here in the room for joining us and online as well. This debate continues a series visiting cities across the United States to foster a vigorous, civil, and constructive national discussion of the future of U.S. foreign policy. Tonight's debate will focus on the future of America's global role, with special attention to 2 issues. First, the role of values in U.S. foreign policy, and second, the use of military force in armed interventions, though I expect that there will be plenty of crossover discussion as well. The debate will proceed in 4 segments, a first round of debate moderated by myself, a question and answer session comprised of questions from our in-person audience and our followers on Twitter, moderated by Jeff Engel of SMU, a second round of debate moderated by myself, and brief closing statements from each of our debaters. To keep the conversation moving, our debaters have been asked to limit their answers to 90 seconds. Our audience in the room and online are encouraged to submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld. And those in the room will also be able to submit questions in writing on note cards collected by debate organizers at about the 15-minute mark during our first segment. So with that, let me introduce our debaters from left to right for those in the audience. First, we have Ted Picone, who is a senior fellow at Brookings with the Brookings Project on International Order and Strategy. He served as a senior foreign policy advisor in the Clinton administration. His research focuses on global democracy and human rights, U.S.-Latin America relations, emerging powers, and multilateral affairs. And his latest book is 5 Rising Democracies and the Fate of the International Liberal Order. Great title. Next, we have Anna Simons, who is a professor of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. Simon's focus has been on conflict intervention and the military from an anthropological perspective, and she is co-author of The Sovereignty Solution, a common sense approach to global security. Next, we have Lauren Schulman. She is the Deputy Director of Studies at the Leon E. Panetta Senior Fellow, and the Leon E. Panetta Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. Her research interests include national security and defense strategy and reform, with a focus on strengthening and modernizing the U.S. national security toolkit. Previously, she served at the Department of Defense in the Bush and Obama administrations, as well as at the Obama White House. And finally, we have John Schuessler. He's an associate professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. Previously, he taught at the Air War College, and he is author of Deceit on the Road to War, President's Politics and American Democracy. So with those introductions, let's dive right in. Ted, let's start with you tonight. Often values are discussed in foreign policy, and it is in terms of values versus interests. How do you define America's national interests, and does the pursuit of those interests ever run afoul of its values?
Well, I think as Americans, we have to start by asking ourselves, what are our values and how should they be reflected in our foreign policy? And we have to start with the fundamental principles of our democratic society as set forth in our founding documents, and as they have evolved over many decades. These are our moral compass, and they're also our legal benchmarks for progress. And I think our principal foreign policy goal, therefore, should be to defend and protect our core values. First, by practicing what we preach, and second, by encouraging, not forcing, but encouraging others who have chosen the path to democracy. So I think the argument that values are separate from interests is a complete false dichotomy. I think you cannot separate them given our history and given our founding principles in the world. And if we look at these questions, even just from the point of view of security and peace, we see how they overlap. Democracies have historically not gone to war against each other. So if you want to avoid war and keep our soldiers and citizens out of harm's way, we should support the goal of strengthening democracy, first in our neighborhood, and then given the global nature of today's threats around the world. We know from empirical evidence, this isn't just like it sounds good, but that strong democracies are much less likely to experience civil wars, less likely to suffer deadly terrorism, have lower levels of violence, including against women, and generate fewer refugees. I think this is a clear case of how values and interests come together.
Ted, let me follow up on that, though. You cite research that says democracies have not gone to war together or are less likely to support war. But we also see that often countries making the transition to democracy are prone to more instability and are prone to often greater conflict. What dangers does that present if we are to encourage countries moving towards democracy, as you've suggested?
It is true that in the short term, countries that are transitioning to democracy are more unstable and more prone to conflict. So our effort should be to move them, help them along to consolidate and strengthen their democracy and get them out of that messy middle where the risks are greatest. So I think we have to be thinking in the long term, we have to have strategic patience, and we have to think about the ways in which societies move toward democracy. We have, thankfully, many, many positive examples in the last century of countries that have chosen the path of democracy, and that we actually in our history have both blocked that progress toward democracy and supported that progress. And I think now we've learned some lessons and can understand, number one, we shouldn't try to impose it at the point of a gun. That will result in failure. It has to be, at the end of the day, the decision of the people of that country. And then at that point, I think we can play a very important role, not necessarily through military intervention, but through economic assistance and through all kinds of academic and scientific and trading relationships that will keep them on the path to democracy.
Great, thank you. John, let me bring this to the real world for a second, if that's all right. Last month, President Donald Trump launched airstrikes in Syria in response to the use of chemical weapons, which the president called an evil and despicable act. However, civilians continue to die in that conflict through other means of warfare. So how should the United States prioritize values when making foreign policy decisions? And when it purports to prioritize those values, how effective is the U.S. really?
Thank you. I think the fact that our response to the atrocity in Syria was limited to token airstrikes kind of demonstrates in practice how we as a country do prioritize responding to atrocities. We're willing to pay a small cost, but not a substantial one, which again in practice reveals that perhaps there is a distinction to be made between interests and values. That is, our decision makers recognize there is value in upholding a norm like the one against using chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction against civilians, but they're not willing to pay a very substantial cost to defend that norm. And I think that's fairly appropriate. Syria is a gruesome and ongoing civil war. And I think, again, what we've revealed in practice as a country is that we do not have a vital interest in helping to determine the winner of that civil war, which has limited the scale of our involvement. I think that's typical of American diplomatic practice over time. I think we loudly and rightly state our principles regarding protecting and respecting human rights, but we're not willing to pay substantial costs to enforce humanitarian values on their own.
Right. Anna, you wrote in 2013 about how Americans study and understand cultures less than they study and understand us. When we discuss embracing values in foreign policy, such as promoting democracy or human rights, are we speaking the same language as other countries in the world?
No, we're not. And before I continue to answer, I should say I am a full-time employee of the Department of Defense, and everything I say is my opinion. Unfortunately, it's not the opinion of the entire department or the government. If it were, we'd be in much better shape. No.
Noted on the record.
But when it comes to values and it comes to interests and when it comes to other people, it's interesting when Ted talks about democracy, because democracy, a little bit like capitalism actually, is based on the individual being the unit of account. We are protected by law in the United States of America as individuals. It's radically different many other places in the world, particularly all the places right now where we're tangling with tribal peoples, where the collective is actually the unit of account. And when you understand the difference between where the individual is the unit of account and we're free to vote for whom we want, and we vote for people who may not be related to us by family or by clan or by tribe or by anything else that has to do with ethnicity, that's fundamentally different from the way most people, many places in the world, still remain organized. And it's not just that they're organized that way. They've got a moral commitment to look out for kin. So I hope this is something that we'll come back to, because my time is about out.
I'd like to jump in on when you get a chance.
Please, no. Ted.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that while your point is very well taken, Americans are very fortunate to be living in a world in which our core values are embedded not only in our domestic laws, but also in the constitutions of dozens of countries around the world, of every type of culture and creed. So that tells us something that, this is become our values, universal values. If you look at the UN treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these are not documents that were forced on these governments. They have endorsed them, signed them, ratified them, and they actually hold it out as aspirational values. But it's true, in practice, it's a very different matter. And so you see many, even just in the world of democracies, many different kinds of democracies, right? We have representative democracies, we have some that are parliamentary and presidential, we have federal systems, systems, but they all share a common kind of fundamental characteristics of free and fair elections, universal suffrage, equality for all, independent judiciaries that uphold due process of law. I mean, these are not just American values. And I think that is a great advantage to us. And don't forget also that when you ask most people outside the United States, what kind of society would you like to live in, most of them do align themselves with basic fundamental human rights.
Anna, do you agree?
No, clearly, clearly I fundamentally disagree. As I've often said and have colleagues who say when we are in Africa, constitutions are about as good as the piece of paper that they're written on. So yes, in theory, yes, in the abstract. The interesting thing is, what country wrote the first constitution? We did, I think. Isn't that correct? We wrote the first constitution, and the constitution was written for us. In terms of when you look at the rights that it enshrines, those were things that we were already doing as proto-Americans. They do not necessarily fit with the way in which people are not just organized, but the way in which people are sort of morally connected to each other in other places. And while everybody says yes to human rights, the conception of human rights are radically different around the world. Here's a for instance. If India was as dominant a country as we are, Texas would not be serving beef in steakhouses, right? And so there's a question in terms of whose rights have been encoded, enshrined, and held up as being universal rights now. And I would say that they are mostly, for better or worse, and I'm not arguing that this is necessarily a bad thing, but they tend to be Western values that are now said to be universal values, and we're seeing all sorts of pushback from around the world in terms of that, to include how China is likely to react in the future.
India is a great example of just the opposite, where Indians themselves have said we would not be able to exist as a nation if we were not a democracy. It is an incredibly diverse country, very pluralist, many different castes and religions and languages, and they've figured out that the only way they could build consensus and not be killing each other all the time is to live as a democracy.
Right. Lauren, let me turn to you here for a second. I want to ask about the role of the military in the promotion of American values abroad, because that is something you've written extensively about. How do you view the military as a institution in spreading American values, and critically, has it been effective in doing so? What's your view on that?
It's a great question, and I think the best way to answer that up front is that sometimes we've been effective and sometimes we've been terribly ineffective. And part of democracy is being able to assess whether or not we have been successful in the past, to take lessons from that and to be responsive to not only our successes and failures, but also the feedback of the American people. But let's think through how complicated this is to actually put in practice day to day. When you're sitting in the Situation Room, you don't think through, well, let's talk about our values or let's talk about our interests. It's a lot more urgent, and the time is the clock as it is right now is ticking away. So let me use an analogy. American foreign policy, when you're in the Situation Room, is like football. I figured this is a good audience for this. It might be in the Dallas Cowboys' interest to say, we're the best in the whole world, and we don't actually want to play a game, we're just actually the best, and that's how we spread our interests worldwide. But that's really not fun in the least. It would be a lot more fun if there's other teams and a league and players and kids who want to be in that league, and they all come together and say, these are things that we agree on. These are our rules that are based on values that we share, like protecting the kicker and make sure the health and safety of other players are prominent. So when we think about how American exercises its foreign policy in the world, we do so based on rules, and we do so based on norms we've come together to agree on, and that's how we would desire to have the military implement our foreign policy.
So let me tug on that thread a little bit.
Sure.
You say our military does so based on rules and norms, and that is a desirable outcome. Yep. But the reality of how America conducts foreign policy in the world is that our military is often training and equipping or assisting other militaries that we might have aligned with that might not necessarily adhere to our same values or standards of conflict. The example that comes to mind for me is the controversy over Saudi bombing in Yemen and over in that conflict. So how do you balance the idea of interests on one hand, for example, in Yemen, helping our Saudi allies, versus values, promoting the law of armed conflict and reducing, minimizing civilian casualties in war?
So the issue you just brought up, aiding and equipping and partnering with partners overseas against, combined security challenges, is the secret sauce of American foreign policy today. It is the new hotness. However, it works best when we share values and interests, and values being the most prominent piece of that, with the partner that we're working with. And when we don't, that's when we tend to see failures, as we are right now in Yemen, as we have in a lot of the continent of Africa, where we're not necessarily coming together on truly joint endeavors. It's more kind of, in our mind, short-term interests. And when you work with partners who agree with the objective, with you on the values you're going to use to execute your objective, with how you're going to treat civilians, how you think about civilian casualties and targeting, this is when you are most successful in these kinds of partnered operations. When you're least successful, it's when you are kind of in basically a short-term relationship. You're hooking up with a partner just for a brief period of time in order to get what you want, and it's actually probably not going to work out that well. You need a long-term relationship that has mutual agreed values and objectives that is going to work out for you in the long term. And that's not always satisfying. Sometimes you're not going to be able to find that. And sometimes you should maybe pull back and say, should we be rethinking how we want to execute the counterterrorism mission, or how we want to execute the mission in Libya, to think through, do we actually have alignment with our partners here?
Right. Let's focus for a moment on a dimension of values that's been getting a lot of greater attention, which is national sovereignty. President Trump mentioned the word sovereignty 21 times in his address to the United Nations. And across Europe, a political wave has swept across the EU, the European Union, in part guided by the returning to sovereignty to the national level. So Anna, I want to ask you, you co-wrote a book, The Sovereignty Solution, arguing that strengthening respect for sovereignty would best serve American interests. On the attacks on the U.S. would be met by overwhelming force, while Washington would promise not to infringe upon other states' rights to cultural integrity, national dignity, and religious freedom. I'm quoting you there. So could Americans be safer from a strategy of live and let live?
I believe so. So let me go back for a little more than half a second, to this question of interests and values. So if you think about national interests, it's very difficult. I mean, I've done this in classes with military officers. What are our national interests? Well, it all depends. For some people, a rising dollar is actually national interest. For other people, for other sets of Americans, other business people, it's actually a falling or a weaker dollar. It may be the free flow of oil, or it might not be if you're heavily invested in alternative energies. It's very difficult to actually talk in terms of what our collective national interests might be, apart from something like physical security. So let me say that I think we shouldn't be talking in terms of interests. We maybe shouldn't even be talking in terms of values, and I can come back to values if you want me to. But instead, we should be thinking in terms of principles or tenets. And the two tenets that we talked about were marrying the concept of to each his own with don't tread on me. In other words, if people in other countries elsewhere want to live according to Sharia or Quranic law, it is not for us to tell them that they shouldn't, that they can't, or to denigrate that. If we were to leave other countries, well, it's not even if we were to leave other countries alone. If we were to encourage everyone around the world to begin to act more like adults and stop treating them as adolescents, and the clock has run out, so you'll have to ask me to continue.
Well, I will ask you to continue. And
I apologize.
It's okay. I will ask you to continue. And I want to ask a specific follow-up here, which is when we're talking about sovereignty and this live and let live attitude, or not attitude, but philosophy, how do you incorporate non-state actors into that question?
Okay, so this is a great question because the whole idea behind sovereignty is you are head of state. You want to be the head of a state somewhere. Okay, now you are responsible for all of the citizens who live in your territory and everybody who holds your passport. That's what we should be expecting of heads of state. That's what we should be holding them accountable for. If you think about sovereignty the way that we think about sovereignty in terms of states and heads of state being responsible, non-state actors would no longer exist. I mean, it requires, we wrote a book because I can't do this in 60 seconds or 90 seconds. But essentially, it's holding to account those who claim that they want all of the deference that's due them as head of state. So it's forcing other governments to now be responsible to their own citizens. If they are not responsible to their own citizens, if they don't fulfill the social contract, and I agree with Ted, democracy is a wonderful thing. I'm just afraid that it's not wonderful for absolutely everyone at this point in time. But if they do not fulfill the social contract to their own citizens, and their own citizens then act up, target us, target allies, and I can get into what makes somebody an ally, then you can respond. But this business of us going around the world foisting sort of our conception of how other people live on them is only causing us more problems rather than helping to solve anything.
Lauren, please.
So that actually sounds like a really great Texan value. And Greg didn't mention this at the beginning. I'm a lifelong Texan. I was born in Texarkana, grew up in Fort Worth. Leaving people alone, being independent, holding them accountable for their actions, and basically letting them live their life. That sounds like what we as Texans aspire to. But think about that for a second. Is that actually the way it works in practice? When your neighbor down the street, when their kid is sick and they need help, do you leave them alone? When there's something going on in your community that's being disruptive to everyone to the extent that it's taking all of your time and energy to deal with the negative effects of that, do you just say, well, they're responsible for that and I hold them responsible and I'm going to back off, even when you as a community could come together to help? Do you vote in elections for different parties? Do you think through how you're going to have impact on your community on a day-to-day basis in ways that may impact your neighbors and may impact the people down the street that you've never met before, your children, your grandparents, everyone else? We don't live in communities as independent fixtures. It sounds nice. It sounds as though that's the way we operate as Texans. But I know that every single one of you have gone down the street to say, hey, how can I help on that? You've been a busybody. You've meddled in some way that was beneficial to you and beneficial to your neighbors down the street. That's how the United States should think of foreign policy, not to the detriment of our own interests, but to be able to create a better international community.
Can I?
Actually, let's hear from John here.
Well, I think the issue I would take with that position is that level of community doesn't exist at the international level. And, you know, we all know when someone gets too involved in running the neighborhood, the other folks in that neighborhood start to resent that person. And,
okay, next door is kind of bad.
What's that?
Next door is kind of bad.
Yes, next door, you know, there's a strange car driving down the street. Where I would agree with Anna is, you know, the old saying is, you know, Americans are the ones who like American leadership. If you start to ask around, it's a little more complicated. I do think I get it that there are certain common problems that won't get solved at the international level without some attempt at leadership. But, you know, we're all hardwired to resist being dominated just from birth. And so if you're on top and you're constantly telling other people what to do and being self-righteous about it, just like children and just like all of us as adults, people get fed up eventually and they find little petty ways of resisting. This is why the US has so many problems with even its closest allies. Our allies, God bless them, relish in finding small ways to kind of demonstrate to us that you're not going to call our tune all the time. And in a way, the Trump presidency has been liberating, I imagine, for some of them, because he's willing to say out loud the way they've felt in private.
So if I can jump in here. I mean, the live and let live ethos I get, and I appreciate that as here in Texas and as Americans. But if you take your theory, Anna, to its logical conclusion and you hold sovereigns responsible for every act of their citizens, and if one of them, a non-state actor or terrorist, come and violate our sovereignty and attack us, then we're going to hold them responsible, and according to your writings, destroy them, obliterate them.
You have to read the writings more carefully.
In any way, I've read your article, and it says words to that effect. And I wonder if by doing that, we are actually asking those sovereigns to create a police state, because if their citizens violate our sovereignty, that will be the end of them, because the Americans are going to come in and take care of it. So I had trouble understanding, what is that world that we wouldn't want to live in that kind of world.
Okay.
Anna, please.
Okay, so two things. One, quickly, is there's a whole procedure that gets engaged in if should somebody bearing a passport, should it be the 9/11 terrorists, right? What did they have? They had Saudi passports. The United States would make certain demands of the Saudi government. The United States wouldn't immediately go to nuking Saudi Arabia. So lots of people, I think purposely sometimes, I'm not saying this of you, but purposely sometimes sort of leave that part out of our argument or misread it. So that's one thing. A second thing is, it is time in the world today to figure out ways in which to encourage other countries to self-police so that we don't end up having to be the global policeman, something at which we are not particularly good. Right? We've enmeshed ourselves in all sorts of places these days, none of which are improving. And in fact, if we were to look at Libya, what we did in Libya is totally unconscionable. If you go to nearby countries in Africa today, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cameroon, they are all dealing with problems that were initiated by our removing Gaddafi, or helping to ensure that Gaddafi got removed, and sort of just washing our hands of the consequences. So police states, no. Self-policing, yes. And again,
but if they
all requires more time.
Okay, but if they don't meet our demands, then how will we respond? We will have to deter them in some way through some kind of direct force. And you're nodding, so, and I think that's just a step too far. Think about the counter reaction once we do try to take them out. That's only going to generate more attacks against us, and you get into this cycle of violence that I don't think would work.
All right, I want to get in one more question here before we turn over to the next section. And that's for you, John. You make an argument in one of your pieces that presidents in democracies or leaders of democracies can move publics towards war without vast public approval. And here in the U.S., that concern has manifested itself in terms of a debate about authorization for use of military force. And I want to ask you, kind of at this juncture of history, Congress, is it sufficiently suited to work as a check on leadership here in the U.S. As we seek to intervene abroad? And if not, are there other ways of addressing gaps in our political system?
In short, no. But I, with the caveat that I think that has a lot to do with the types of wars we've been fighting lately. So the amazing thing about Congress is how willing it is as a body to delegate away its powers in this area. To go back to the 2013 Syria episode, many members of Congress were quite upset that Obama indicated he would like a vote, because it would force them to go on the record on this issue. They wanted him to, quote, lead, AKA act unilaterally, without forcing a difficult vote on them. Now, why is this happening? I think partly it's because being a good, rich, capitalist, democratic country, we've managed to refine warfare to the point where it doesn't involve much mobilization. A lot of this is because we're running around hitting at insurgent groups rather than fighting somebody who can fight back. So basically, I think Congress will, by necessity, have to get more involved if any future war, God forbid, involves more mobilizational demands in terms of money and human sacrifice. We are blessed with an unparalleled professional military. I just reviewed a book that basically points out we don't finance wars through war taxes anymore. It's all done through debt. We love drones and special forces. This is basically what allows Congress to really not have to do much to exercise its powers in this area.
Lauren, please.
This is an area where I completely agree with you. This is hugely problematic, the way Congress has stepped back from its role in providing oversight of U.S. military intervention abroad. And one of the problems is not necessarily the U.S. goals and intent of such interventions, but the fact that it is totally untransparent with Congress, as well as you, the American people, over how long is this going to take? How much is it going to cost? What are we going to need from partners in order to make sure that we're successful? We can initiate these with a lot of pomp and circumstance and with great mission accomplished banners and parades and other things that make us feel good about these interventions. But nobody ever comes forward to say, hey, by the way, we're going to be in Afghanistan for 17 years and our goals will still effectively be the same without having accomplished much. This is a problem with American foreign policy right now, that you are not as involved as you should be. And that's because we have not been, as a government, as transparent as we need to be. We have values that I believe are good and right and can be acted upon, but should be acted upon in a way that is more selective and more strategic and has more understanding of our interests and also our limitations. There are times when we won't need or want to spend as much American blood and treasure towards the values that we aspire to, And with that, I feel that it's not only a role of Congress, but it's a role of you to push back and say, we can support the troops and we can support the American foreign policy objectives without necessarily doing so with a blank checkbook.
Great. Okay. We're now going to switch over. We'll return to this discussion. Don't worry. We're going to switch over to Jeff Engel from SMU now here for questions submitted by our audience and on Twitter.
Thank you, and thank you for this lively debate so far. I think that our Twitter and our audience questions really reflect a basic consistent point, which is that this debate has been a wonderful discussion on the theoretical level of what American values and interests are. The audience would like to know what's going on tomorrow and today. So let me ask a question looking at our current president, whose name has actually been mentioned surprisingly infrequently, I think, in the first part of this debate, to note the following, which is that the previous president received the Nobel Peace Prize in his first year in office largely to his surprise. He was on the record as noting that he did not believe he had done anything to achieve it other than be in office. Our current president, you might note, has been actively lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize. Could you please, and I'll start this with Lauren, could you please give a sense, if you will, of how the global perception of the United States has changed since President Trump's arrival in office?
So fairly or not, I think the global perception of the United States has gone from being a reliable partner and somebody that many countries would aspire to emulate in some ways to someone who is an unreliable partner. And that's not necessarily always a bad thing. The United States is not always going to be a reliable partner. We won't be able to back up Europe militarily on everything. We won't be able to outspend our allies constantly in terms of the military. It's good in some ways for people to think that maybe the United States is not going to solve every problem for us constantly. However, we're in a situation right now where if the United States exempts itself from global leadership, we have other countries that are more than willing to take up the mantle and not in ways that would be in the interest of you and me and everyone else in this room right now. Russia and China are more than happy to take over the mantle of our economic power, of our political influence, of our control of how we operate overseas in terms of human rights and values. They're actively exercising influence in ways that they know that the Trump administration has pulled back from. They know that the battlefield today is values and political systems. They're not going to defeat us militarily, nor do they want to. They want to look at this system, this battlefield right now in terms of, hey, can we influence Australia to have slightly less free press? Can we influence Europe to have less trust in its democratic systems? And the Trump administration has unfortunately allowed that lapse to occur in American leadership.
John, let me ask you a follow-up to that statement,
Sure.
Which was, if the United States has, if you will, ceded, as Lauren suggests, a level of global leadership to other countries around the world, which countries around the world would you feel comfortable taking up the mantle of global leadership?
That's a loaded question. I mean, to be consistent with my theoretical priors, that dirty word theory, I'm mainly concerned with American security, which I think is reconcilable with sharing the world potentially with other major powers. So it's inevitable that the United States will decline in power over time from our current high peak, and that others will rise to approximate us in power. And my message would just be, let's get some practice in living in that kind of world. So I think we'll still have a ton of influence over many like-minded states, and I think that's a great enduring advantage of the United States. But what we haven't had much practice in lately is coexisting with others who have also substantial influence. And this is what we're going to be dealing with China and Russia. So I resist the framing of the question. As a good realist, I don't see it as a choice, kind of who do we want to hand off the reins to? I would just say we don't have a choice. We are going to live in a world where there are other major powers. We need to make sure that they can't monkey around in the Western Hemisphere and make a lot of trouble for us close to home. But beyond that, we need to kind of get some habits of mind going that say, all right, here are your prerogatives and here are ours. Can we strike a deal?
So let me get you to actually answer the question now. Which is to say, you're absolutely right, of course, that we don't have the opportunity to hand off necessarily to other powers around the world as we would like. What countries should we be concerned about if they begin to take up the global mantle of leadership? And if those countries were to take a global leadership, what countries might make you reconsider your position that the United States must re-engage to a higher level?
I mean, the quick answer for me is China, because China, if it continues to grow at a rapid clip and converts that growth into military power, will far surpass the Soviet Union in its overall power capabilities, which means it will be the most substantial threat in terms of a peer competitor that the United States has faced in some time. Now, you can go in one of two directions with that. Either you can gear up for the coming Cold War with China, or you can think about ways of coexisting with a peer. And it's probably going to end up being a mixture of both. So I worry about China, and I hope for the best, but I fear for the worst.
Thank you. Anna, this question is for you. How would you define or describe both Donald Trump's foreign policy after the first 18 months of his administration, and more specifically, do you see a Trump doctrine at play?
So the cheap answer to this question is he hasn't quite come around to sovereignty solution and to what it requires to actually reinvigorate sovereignty and get other countries to not just bear more of the burden in terms of what happens with the global commons and everything else, but to police themselves. I don't know that there's a Trump doctrine yet. I don't know that there ever will be a Trump doctrine. I think it's a little odd that we place on every president the requirement to actually come up with some coherent doctrine, because I think, unfortunately, we are wired as Americans politically to think in terms of interests. And I think it's really hard to have a doctrine when you're only thinking in terms of interests, because most often your interests are expedient and you're continually reacting. So I sort of somewhat dodged the question, but I think it's still way too early to tell with him.
Ted, same question to you.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a whole new form of foreign policy that's very unconventional, unpredictable, and intentionally so. The idea that we're going to surprise people and switch left and right from day to day will somehow keep our enemies guessing and hedging their bets. It also has the dynamic of the others, adversaries, expecting the worst from us, and therefore feeding a sense of hostility and even an arms race that they can't trust us, so we better, expect the worst. And I don't think that's the kind of world we want to live in that's safe for us and our children. I think the other thing we've seen is a complete abdication of our leadership role on our values, on democracy and human rights, and particularly the behavior at home and the way in which our institutions and our moral codes are being eviscerated by the very ugly rhetoric, the attacks on journalists, on judges, on your political opponents. What kind of example does that set for the rest of the world and our own citizens? So I feel like that's really damaging our reputation in the world and our ability to have influence. If we want to have allies on the team, if you think about the football sports analogy, we want to be on the field with team members we agree with and share those values. We're making it much harder for them to join us.
Lauren, let me turn to you for this softball from the crowd.
All right.
Which is peace still possible in the Middle East? And is the current Trump administration helping or hindering in that goal?
So the optimist in me says that peace is still possible everywhere, but under the terms that we define or that are defined by the people in the region in, either in coordination with us or on their own terms. I think that to go to the far easier part of the question in terms of whether or not the Trump administration is helping or hindering, I think that they have had no consistent foreign policy for the Middle East, despite the fact that that the president regularly tweets on it, that his son-in-law is regularly involved in activist foreign policy in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and elsewhere, and in Israel as of today. To your point on whether or not people can trust us and whether or not our partners will have an understanding of what our goals are, it's really hard for any country in the Middle East right now to take as seriously as someone who either wants to be fully involved and fully helpful, and either in a military, economic, or diplomatic sense, or who wants to pull out entirely. Because you hear the same thing on a day-to-day basis, or you hear different things on a day-to-day basis. Without that consistency, regardless of what it is, we're no longer a trusted partner who is going to have a true influential role there. And is that something that we want? I think that's possibly up for debate. But the lack of ability of our partners and allies to know or have a sense of where we're going to come down on an issue is not something that makes us look cool. It's not something that makes us look like, Fonzie wearing the leather jacket. It makes us look like an idiot. And right now, we're not a good partner for the Middle East right now as a result.
Let me ask this question, which I think has specific resonance for the conversation that began with values, and that is to apply a little bit of history and look at our current situation at the same question, which is, should the United States have encouraged NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War? Ted, I'd like you to take that one.
Yes, I think it was absolutely the right call. And if you think about the history of Europe and the years and years, centuries of war on that continent to today, where we have a continent that's united and free and democratic and at peace, that is a huge achievement. And that was largely the result of a US-led systematic change after World War II, where we created the United Nations and a whole set of treaties and cooperative security, and of course NATO playing a key role there. When those countries broke free of the Soviet Union, they begged to join NATO, and for good reason. They still, to this day, see Russia as the enemy, and they need to be protected from them. Now, there's a debate about how far it should reach. Georgia, Ukraine, is that too close to Russia, and is Russia seeing that as a direct threat to them and too aggressive? And I think that's a debatable point. I actually think that, and as you know, those countries are not part of NATO. They would very much like to be, and there are questions about what promises were made. But in the end of the day, we have Europeans have created with our support a unified Europe that is much stronger than it was in the past and creating great prosperity for its people.
Anna, would you like to answer the same question?
Sure, I totally disagree.
I was hoping you would. Yeah.
Warsaw Pact went away, NATO should have gone away. Maybe something else could have been configured in its stead later on. But as not just a gesture of goodwill, but as something that would be commonsensical. As soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, as soon as Warsaw Pact fell apart, NATO should have fallen apart, because that's why NATO existed, was to oppose the Warsaw Pact countries and the Soviet Union. The other thing I would say is that we have long been unreliable for lots of people we consider to be our allies, or we call our allies, or we call our partners, particularly non-Westerners. And we can't forget that, I don't know if anybody in here remembers Operation Provide Comfort. That was in the wake of the first Gulf War. That was where we encouraged the Shia and the Kurds to rise up. Operation Provide Comfort was what we had to do once the Kurds had risen up to try to throw off Saddam Hussein. That the Kurds trust us at all these days is fairly miraculous, beyond the fact that they're pursuing their own interests at the moment, and in large part using us the same way we are trying to use them in terms of a proxy force going up against ISIS. But the notion that we have ever, in the recent past, been a reliable partner for anyone, I think needs to be seriously re-examined, with the exceptions of some Western European countries, and perhaps, I am not a Latin Americanist, maybe you can make the argument in certain regions in Latin America or certain countries in Latin America, but nowhere else.
Let me pick up, Lauren, and turn this question to you. I'd like to pick up on something that Ted just mentioned, that there are certain areas of the world which are, of course, closer to Moscow than others. And Ted suggested perhaps if you are too close, one should not be invited to join the Western community. Where would you draw the line?
I think this is actually a question as much for me as it is for all of you. I go back to my former boss, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who raised the legitimate question of would we ever declare Article 5, or would we ever agree to the declaration of Article 5 for some of the newer NATO members between Latvia, I can't remember the example he used, but it was Latvia or Lithuania or one of the Baltic states. Would we actually feel comfortable as a country saying that we would come to their defense? And that's an argument that I don't think we had after the Cold War, where I agree with Anna that perhaps NATO does, actually fully agree, NATO does have a vital role in our national security today. But we should have had a better debate as a nation about what does that mean? Who would we willingly go to the defense of? Who would we willingly risk the lives of young men and women in uniform in pursuit of our own foreign policy objectives? So that is perhaps something that we would all agree, yes, this is in our national interest. But if it wasn't, we should have talked through what are the other options that we feel comfortable with. And if the United States decided to go ahead and do it against the interests, against the wishes of of the American people, to be able to go to them openly and say, here's why that matters to us. And you hear these sorts of speeches using a lot of academic terms about why would we want to do so? But you rarely see people come down in elections and go door to door and say, this is why this is important for us to continue to be a part of NATO. I think it's important, but we should talk to all of us more about why that's important as well.
Thank you. John, several people actually picked up on something that you mentioned in an earlier comment, that suggesting that the decline of the United States is perhaps inevitable. This is a point which, as a historian, I'm sympathetic to. It happened to Rome. It's likely to happen again. But the audience does not agree with you or I. So could you please explain to the audience further why you believe it's inevitable, and more importantly, is there anything that we could or should do to arrest the decline?
Okay, great. So I should have been clear. I'm talking about relative decline. So the U.S. has a ton going for it. First of all, geography. We have the best geographic situation you could ask for as a great power. Weak neighbors to the north and south, oceans on either side. We are almost invulnerable to conventional threats. Ask a Finnish officer and they'll remind you what it feels like, for example, to have a great power next door. We have incredible levels of human capital. We have the best university system in the world. We have a vibrant economy. We have a relatively open society. We're open to immigration, which has been a great boon to us over time in terms of our demographics. A lot of our potential competitors are going to decline demographically. What I'm really talking about is that what we can't do a lot about is others rising. So the U.S. is going to continue to enjoy a great power political position for many decades, but it simply won't be so far above everybody else as the Chinese, the Indians, and others slowly but surely start to close the gap. And really, the academic debate on this, I think most people concede the gap will eventually be narrowed. It's a matter of how long can we continue to play out this great situation we've had since the end of the Cold War. And I think most agree that it's not going to outlast the century, hence my point about getting used to coexistence.
Ted, let me turn the same question, if you will, in a different way towards you, and ask, what would you do if you were asked by the current administration to help arrest America's decline, if you agree with John's initial assessment, and what might the best thing to do for the United States to do in order to try to close the parity gap, if you will, with, or I should say, lengthen the parity gap between ourselves and our competitors?
Well, I agree that we are geographically in a very strong position, and we live in a neighborhood that, in addition to having peaceful Canada and Mexico nearby, there's no nuclear weapons, there's no regional wars. We're in a good place. But I think it's very naive to think that the rise of Russia and China will not come at our expense. And so what do we need to do? First, we've got to strengthen our own society at home. I think we are facing a major, steady deterioration across the board in terms of the quality of education that our children are getting, the quality of healthcare and how universal it is, the way in which we handle civic education and we teach people how to self-govern. It's not easy. It's a very fragile system that we've created, and we've let things slide over many years. Look at the opioid crisis in this country. It is an abomination. 60,000 people died last year from opioids and overdoses. This is unacceptable, and what are we doing? This should be a national crisis, and we're not doing enough to deal with it. We've got rising inequality, et cetera. We can go on down the line. So I think if we want to maintain a leadership role in the world and just have a strong society, we've got to tackle these problems in a very serious way.
Thank you. I have been given the opportunity for one more question, and this is one which is a little bit off topic, but I think it's just too wonderful not to ask. It's for Anna, comes from the audience. How does being an anthropologist give you a different perspective on foreign policy decision-making, perhaps from those you work with on a daily basis or from your colleagues on the stage?
Okay, great question. I would say, because I mostly teach special operations officers and mostly special forces, which are Green Berets. They spend more time these days on the ground in dusty villages than I do right now. But I would say there is a difference between those who spend time in hinterland areas with marginal populations and those who are sitting in Washington, and I'm not talking about the people on the stage right now. No, I really am not. But folks who are making policy in Washington who have probably never spent a night by themselves anywhere remote with a non-Western population. And I think we've got serious problems as a consequence of that kind of foreign policy making. So I would say it's just too bad that anthropology has become the most politically correct of the social sciences, and you find very few anthropologists who are willing to talk to, never mind even work with, anybody who's from the Department of Defense. This is very sad, which now allows me to segue and say something that I wanted I totally agree with Ted. I would say that our greatest vulnerability as a country is our divisibility. And that's what China, that's what Russia, that's what anybody else is going to try to take advantage of. But that's also another reason why we should be us here at home and let other people be themselves. We can't be all things to all people. And so get our own house in order, absolutely. Become a promised land again, and exemplary, not a crusader state, to use Walter McDougall's great title of a book. 4-word title, sums it all up.
Thank you. Let me provide thanks to our audience and to our folks watching and viewing at home through Twitter for those great questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to Greg.
Jeff, thank you so much, and thank you for those great questions from our audience. So dovetailing off the discussion, we're going to turn now here to the case of humanitarian intervention. And Lauren, I'd like to start with you. Mm-hmm. The question of whether or not there is a Trump doctrine was discussed just a couple minutes ago. And I think it's a particularly relevant one. As we look back, some administrations have chosen to intervene in certain conflicts, others have not. For example, President Obama, in intervening in Libya in 2011, he later came to call that one of the failures or great mistakes of his presidency. So the question is there a framework that can guide America intervening on humanitarian grounds, and how do you avoid unintended consequences?
Well, to answer the last part of your question, it's impossible to avoid unintended consequences in foreign policy. This is something that we live in a democracy. We would love to be able to vote in and out unintended consequences, but it doesn't work that way. When you engage in the world stage in any way, things are going to happen that you can't predict, and that has to be accessible to us in some way. And the way that we should mitigate that is going back to my earlier point of choosing to intervene when we, one, can make a difference, a true difference, and we're willing to sustain that over a long enough period of time that it's going to be game-changing for the country or the region or whatever national interest we're trying to defend in that way. It also needs to be systemic in the sense that military intervention alone is never going to be enough. No, in no instance, certainly not in Syria where we intervened as against or responded as against chemical weapons attacks. There has to be other levers that we use between political, economic, other partners in the region. We can't ignore those, and we're underinvesting in those in a really horrific way right now. And we need to do so in countries where it's important to us and where our partners are going to want to be engaged over a long period of time. And these are really high bars. These are high bars that in the Situation Room you don't want to talk about because you really want to do the right thing for the kids, or you want to do the right thing for the baby that was on the beach. But you have to be realistic in terms of what is it we are as Americans able to do, and along with what we want to do.
So, Anna, I want to ask you this question because you make the argument in a strong sovereignty world that states are the most important actors here. Are there circumstances where you think the United States should intervene with force on humanitarian grounds? And what do you think about this idea of the need to create a consistent approach in how you intervene abroad?
So the argument that we've made is that in the triage phase of any natural disaster, nobody's better than the United States at responding. The United States Navy goes all out in terms of whether it's tsunami relief or any other kind of relief. We are great at that stuff. Nobody's better than we are when it comes to logistically delivering aid to people who are in acute need. Where we really fall down is when we try to assist people where there's been chronic failure. We get sucked in, and what we contribute ends up actually contributing to corruption and to governments not being able to, not having to deliver what they should deliver to their own people. So a classic example of this is drought versus famine. Droughts very often will turn into famine. The difference is drought is lack of rainfall, lack of water. Famine is lack of food getting to those who are hungry. Any responsible government, like our own, for instance, we've got a drought now where? Here. Any responsible government should be able to foresee, as a drought is occurring, that there are going to be people who need food. It's up to that government to be able to deliver that food. It is not necessarily up to us because famine is a political problem. If food does not get delivered to the starving, that's an indicator that we're talking about a government that is not fulfilling its social contract to its own population. So there are certain ways to intervene, certain circumstances under which we can consistently intervene, and then there are other situations in which we will get embroiled in political problems from which it will be impossible to successfully extract ourselves.
Ted, I want to ask you about the idea of partnerships when we're looking at intervening abroad, particularly humanitarian interventions. And you brought up in the previous discussion a good example of NATO expansion. NATO has become an instrument in which the U.S. can kind of provide assistance in situations even outside of Europe. With rising powers no longer converging towards Western ideas of human rights and kind of trending back more towards this sovereignty-first mindset. Are there swing nations or states that the U.S. Can partner with to undertake interventions?
So I've done a lot of work looking at rising democracies as swing states that could join us in the burden sharing that is necessary. I absolutely agree. We should not be out there by ourselves solving all the world's problems. So you'd think that democratic countries would share some of our concerns and interests, and in fact, they've signed up to some things and not others. But we have a problem convincing them because they really don't like our aggressive, assertive way of intervening in other countries, usually through use of force or coercive sanctions. So we've lost some opportunities along the way. And that requires us to step back a little bit and rethink, and I think there's a lot of agreement on this panel actually, in the way in which we conduct our foreign policy. We have certain principles that are the bedrock of where we want, the kind of world we want to see. But I feel sometimes where we disagree is in this, I think, somewhat unrealistic expectation that other states will really have the ability to deliver the kind of food and services to their people in the current state they're in. So I think we have to be realistic. Now, if we look at a country like India, India is a rising power. India is a democracy. It's the world's largest democracy. And I think it has great potential to be a partner with us in all kinds of problems. They have a real concern about a rising China, and so they're with us on that. And they're becoming more and more capable of joining us and more interested and willing to join us. So I think that's on the positive side of the scale.
So you bring up India on the positive side of the scale. What about countries that might not be so much on that positive side of the scale? Are there risks to partnering with countries whose actions might be seen by some as illegitimate? And what risks does that carry for the United States?
Well, I don't know if you have a specific case in mind, but I would like to come back to the case of Libya, where it was seen as very legitimate. It was done under this new doctrine of responsibility to protect, where sovereigns do have the responsibility. They not only have rights, they have duties to protect their people. And so when they start violating those rights and committing ethnic cleansing and genocide, they've kind of lost their authority to act as legitimate sovereigns. And at that point, the international community has agreed to intervene. Now, through diplomacy, through mediation, through sanctions, is ultimately military force, and that's where things really went wrong in the case of Libya. So you could say in that case, because we did such a bad job of follow-through, our NATO looks bad as a kind of coalition of states doing the right thing. And we see the results in Syria. I mean, the Syrian people have suffered. We cannot find a winning coalition to find a way to stop the killing in Syria. What has the killing led to in Syria? It's led to proxy wars. It's led to empowerment of Iran. It's led to flows of millions of refugees in not only Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, but to Europe, and our own concerns that they're going to come to us and invade us and through terrorism. I mean, this is a very bad situation. If we had done some action early on, some kind of limited airstrikes that would at least take out some of the air power that Assad had to bomb his own people, I think we could have contained the problem, not solved it, contained it.
Please, John.
I would take issue with that. Civil wars are existential for the local actors. That's why they're so brutal. And the fact of the matter in Syria is every other important actor values something above ending the violence. It's why we've had so limited traction. And that includes our partners in the region. They are competing for influence in Syria. Their goals are not humanitarian. This is the problem. The Assad regime's goal is to win the civil war. If you look at any civil war in history, they're incredibly brutal affairs. Assad might be brutal, but it's not because he as a person is brutal all the time. It's because he's waging a brutal civil war. And these are the exact scenarios where the U.S. is going to have the toughest time, quote, projecting our values. These are not ideal cases for securing those kinds of goals. Rwanda, sadly, was a much better case where, because of the nature of the killing and how quickly it progressed, the U.S. might have intervened quickly and saved a lot of lives. But in an ongoing brutal civil war with this many outside influences, I think we just have much less potential to do any good.
Yes.
I want to go back to a point that Anna made earlier as a follow-up to this. One of the problems with how the United States, I guess, did not intervene in Syria was its lack of consistency and its absence of credibility. The United States over and over again hinted that maybe it would do a little bit more in Syria, but never actually did, whether or not it would arm the opposition, whether or not it would intervene militarily, provide more support for the Syrian opposition in some way. And it did in dribs and drabs. But it never did enough to do so decisively. And there was absolutely an expectation in the Syrian opposition and in the international community that that would happen one day. And the number of people that died as a result of that lack of consistency and absence of credibility is something that I hope haunts the Obama administration, myself included, for a long time. This is something where if we want to have values in foreign policy and we don't want to necessarily go forth and execute the resources that are necessary to actually uphold them, we need to be honest with ourselves, with the people that we are supporting or not supporting, and with all of you to say, this is important to us, but it's not important to us enough to risk the things that are important to all of you. So that is my feelings on the Syrian civil war.
Can I just say, I absolutely agree. The lack of consistency sets up moral hazard problems for populations all over the world, where they expect that a cavalry is going to come riding to the rescue. We lead them to believe that they're going to get some sort of assistance. We know ourselves from our own revolution. Yes, eventually we got assistance, but what did we do? We fought it. Largely on our own, and when it looked like we were winning, then who came in and was willing to actually back us much more? We need to think of that when we're looking at when we're looking at these other situations around the world, and we need to remember that as soon as people hear that the United States might come and help, what are they likely to do? They're likely to start acting more like victims, so that we really will come and help, as opposed to actually standing up and figuring out how to fight on their own. Just food for thought in terms of this issue, where I think we actually really do agree.
John, I want to follow up with you on one question here. You mentioned that the situation, you brought up the Syria example, is the exact type of situation where the U.S. is going to have the hardest time kind of influencing the situation there. We see the Trump administration's national security strategy has really put a greater, or attempted to put a greater emphasis on the return of great power conflict. So when we get humanitarian interventions, like the situation in Syria, like the situations in other countries around the world, do intervening in these circumstances take our eyes off the ball of the real threat, which China and Russia, namely?
I do think potentially. Again, we are a rich country with a globe-girdling, is that a praise, military, and so we are able to intervene and be postured and be present in lots of places, in lots of ways. But again, I think this is an artifact of recent history, where the U.S. has really not had to deal with anything that looks like a peer competitor for some time. I think, my teaching at the War College already, as I was leaving, these discussions of tough choices were happening all the time. You talked about NATO expansion. Probably the best evidence that we probably shouldn't have expanded is that we were not prepared to defend any of the countries on the eastern flank of NATO, which we're now rushing to make up for at the last minute. And we have to be clear about this. When I say defend, I mean risk nuclear war. Lauren put the question exactly right. Are you willing to risk nuclear war over Lithuania? If not, call your congressperson. So I do think we are approaching a point where hard choices are coming, and if we, especially the Obama administration wanted to, quote, pivot a bit away from the Middle East toward Asia for exactly this set of reasons, and through no fault of their own, they had a lot of frustration doing so, but I think their instincts were right.
All right, moving to our final section of the debate here. The United States has intervened in conflicts in a variety of ways over the past 7 decades. That includes from large-scale use of ground forces to drone strikes or aerial bombings. The range of what constitutes an intervention is really expanding. So Lauren, I want to turn to you here for a second. particularly relevant in the wake of the report from the Pentagon on our 4 service members who lost their lives in Niger last fall. You wrote in The Atlantic that the United States has deployed troops across the world under benign categories such as building partner capacity, light footprint, or assisting and accompanying. A lot of these deployments are in fact enduring. So should we consider these types of models as interventions? And is this model, I think we could sum it up by the phrase by, with, and through perhaps, is that a model that's working for the US?
It's a great question. So in terms of whether or not it's intervention, I think that question really varies, but that's not something that the United States gets to decide when it's committing those forces to do whatever it is it's planning to do, whether it be training forces in Niger or accompanying forces in, I guess now actually in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The decision of whether or not that becomes a kinetic conflict is not up to us, it's up to our adversaries. And that's not necessarily something you can easily predict when you are receiving a report in Congress of like, oh yes, half a dozen ODA soft team went over to Niger today, I guess that sounds good to me. But not beyond the by, with, and through approach, whether or not something actually constitutes intervention, we should look at how Russia in particular, but also China, is considering military operations and warfare these days. There's a lot of political steps between the Russian intervention in democracies and elections, how China is intervening and how academia is funded and the extent to which there is academic freedom, not only in the United States, but amongst our allies. China's their power play basically throughout the Middle East, East Asia, and South Asia to have more economic influence there. These are each things that maybe 50 years ago we would not have considered warfare. But all of them are causing fairly significant harm to us, if not impact to us on a national security perspective. We're not debating both those harms and also our means to respond to them in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So I will just add to what Lauren said, which is that I think we're on the cusp of some serious changes in terms of military power. Mm-hmm. So that while we remain militarily, we can dominate lots of places and military power is very important, there are going to be an increasing number of things, we're already starting to see this, that other countries, small countries even, can actually do to us to undermine us. And we're vulnerable in all sorts of ways that our military power is not going to be able to redress, and that's not going to require others to use military power against us, which the flip side of this is Russia and China, they can rise, but they've got plenty of vulnerabilities as well. And so what the world is going to look like in terms of whether you want to call it intervention, interference, influence, any one of a number of words, it's about to look profoundly different from anybody who's my age might have expected, or even those who are slightly younger. So one thing to think about, and this has come up with students who actually are officers in Baltic countries, is small countries should work much harder on making themselves toxic so that nobody would want to try to absorb them. Nobody would, no, I'm serious. That's about as good a method as any in terms of, it's self-policing, but also encouraging other countries to figure out how to defend themselves using very unconventional means.
Can I
Ted,
jump in?
And I'd like to ask you a specific question, it's okay. I think one of the things that's being referred to here is there's a term that's used, it's called gray zone conflict, which is the idea of countries using means other than hard force by which to influence their neighbors or enemies. So it's been particularly relevant in Europe and Eastern Europe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the United States should even begin to approach this new type of warfare.
I mean, I think it's relevant now, today, and here in the United States, and we've already been attacked through this means. We had direct interference in our elections last November 2016. Has anyone been reading about that? I mean, it's not contested. This was a foreign hostile power who intervened in the heart of our representative democratic system. So I don't think we should be naive about Russia and China's intentions here. When you have authoritarian powers that are out to protect and defend their system, they're not just going to stay at home and do this, they're going to reach out beyond. And they're going to try to divide what has been a rather successful transatlantic and broader alliance that they may say is pitted against them. But in fact, we're both have competing interests to defend our systems, and they're clashing more and more. Now, in terms of the tools at hand, we know that there is great vulnerabilities in our system in terms of our critical infrastructure. Electricity, the lights you turn on at home, the water, the gas that we get, these are all very vulnerable systems. So all kinds of cyber attacks and intrusions and hacking that can be done by a very weak individual. I mean, it's not a matter of a big, great power that comes in to interfere. Then you add in artificial intelligence and automated weaponry that is potentially leading us toward a great new arms race that we should be prepared for.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you bring up the point of strengthening our defenses against these new types of conflict. And of course, we saw that most vividly in the last presidential election. But what about offensive capabilities? Is this a type of warfare we should be engaging in abroad?
I think we should very selectively. So in the case of the most important one that we know to date, Iran, Stuxnet, interference with the nuclear weapons development, I think that's a case in which we probably do want to deploy that offensively. And you can imagine a couple of others, but I would leave it to the very high order threats, existential threats of nuclear and other kinds of biological weapons, for example.
John, let me ask you, how does this change the playing field upon which states compete and engage in conflict?
Well, I've been listening to all this, and a lot of it sounds reminiscent of the early Cold War. So we have been here before. When the Soviet Union first emerged as a competitor of the United States in the wake of World War II, the threat was largely political and economic in nature and not military. And so if you look at the way George Kennan, the architect of containment, thought about countering them, it was all about political and economic remedies. He actually talked about starting at home and strengthening American society. And only later was containment militarized. So I actually agree with a lot of what I've heard. I think it changes the playing field from where we've been at recently, but the US does have experience dealing with this kind of competition, and it does have experience thinking about it in political and economic rather than just military terms.
I would just add, I'm not going to be like a talking head. They always, what do they do? They always sort of fantasize about all the things that can be done, and then they compete with each other to see who can be more creative in terms of making suggestions on air. But I will say, we've got plenty of smart people in uniform. They can be extremely creative in terms of doing various unconventional things, should that be required. And we should probably be thinking far less about how we react and much more about how we potentially bait certain traps. And I won't say anything more than that, but we could be much more creative than we are.
Great. All right, I want to pose one more question to all of you on stage here today. And that is, especially for our audience members here in Dallas and for those watching on live stream, how can people who are interested in these issues and concerned about these issues stay engaged and be involved and influence policy? What advice do you have for the public? Ted, let's start with you.
Well, it starts, as I said earlier, with civic education, and that starts at a very young age. So it has to begin in our classrooms and our homes to teach people, to teach our young people about the world, about how we self-govern, but also about other cultures, other ways of life, and a better appreciation for not only our differences, but our common features as human beings. I think this is what worries me about the rise of nationalism in America first. It it kind of reduces the fact that we are living in one common planet and we need to come up with common solutions to all these problems that we have. And so I think that starts with at the young age and can continue. Of course, we have a strong media, I think, with lots of information. And now with the World Wide Web, the global internet, we have so much information at our fingertips, but we have to be critical about it. We have to, critically think about what information we're taking in. I would love to see more Americans travel personally and come in contact, whether it's sleeping in a hut or in a Hilton hotel somewhere else is up to them. But I think just getting out of our bubble would be very important. Learn foreign languages. We have such an advantage that English is the dominant language in the world. But guess what? Millions and millions of people don't speak English. And so if we want to understand them, we need to help others and ourselves understand them in their language.
Great. Anna, same question.
So following up on the bubble, I would say my half-facetious comment would be, don't watch so much Fox, don't watch so much MSNBC, don't watch so much CNN, and turn off a lot of the talking heads who really are just competing for airtime and aren't necessarily accurate at all in terms of what they're saying. Yes, the obvious answer is more debates, right? More debates like this, which I would say again, I'll say that again in my closing comment. But I will say something following up on this, which is not necessarily directly related, but I think it absolutely does relate. I think our greatest source of insecurity is not necessarily what other people have planted into our computers or the fact that an EMP can shut off our systems. Our greatest source of insecurity is the fact that we no longer have a credible, overarching source of information that all Americans are willing to listen to. And how we rectify this, I think, should be an absolutely pressing national security concern. Should there be some sort of crisis in the near future, the degree to which we are divided and that those channels I mentioned continue, the cable channels and others, continue to divide us, is going to make it extremely difficult for us to pull together and stay together for any length of time. So anything that you can think of that sort of tilts against that, I am 100% for.
Lauren?
So I have a really easy option for all of you, and that is listen to more podcasts, starting with mine. I have a podcast called Bombshell that is 3 women who talk about national security, foreign policy issues every 2 weeks with other women guests coming on with different areas of expertise. We try to debate, like we're doing here today, all different sides of an issue. The other piece of advice that I would have for everyone here, including myself and the panel, everyone in the room, is stop treating America's role in the world like a zero-sum game. The person whose auditorium we're in today, President Bush, said that America has encouraged and benefited from the global advance of free markets, from the strength of democratic alliances, and from the advance of free societies. And he said this wasn't out of pure altruism. It was out of raw, calculated interest. We have grown incomparably wealthy and powerful under the system that we created that advanced all of those interests. But there was a cost to it, and we don't talk often enough about that cost. The cost, we're really good at trade deals. We are not really good at talking about how to mitigate the negative effects of those trade deals to our local economies. We're really good at promoting democracy overseas. Actually, we're not that great at it, but we think about it a lot. We are less good at promoting democracy at home and talking about the issues that Ted raised. These aren't zero-sum games. We can do both. But the demand signal has to be there from all of us to our local congressman, to our president, to say, focus on those things that serve our interests. But we need you to serve our interests as well and have that be part of the same game.
John, you have the final word.
Okay. I would just encourage 2 things, the professor part of me. One is ask yourself, what things do you undeniably believe are true? And then ask once in a while, are they really true? What are your baseline assumptions, things you don't even think about on a daily basis, maybe about America's role in the world? The other thing is seek out people and ideas that grate on you, that bother you, that rile you up. I fight with my father-in-law all the time about politics, but what's shocking is I think about him all the time when I'm about to make an argument, because I want to know, how can I make the best version of this argument that's going to respect the person that might disagree with me, and yet recognize the disagreement, but don't make it disagreeable. My wife's going to be horrified if she's watching at home to know that I just said that. But I think it's really important, because really what's happened, I think, is not that we're more divided, it's that we're more intolerant of those divisions. It's just totally unrealistic to think in a great diverse country we're going to agree on first principles all the time. We have to find a way to coexist with those who see the world in a different way. And certainly since Election Day 2016, living in College Station, Texas, I have tried to do that more, and I hope that all of you will join me in doing that. Anyway, thank you for that sermon.
Well, I can't think of any better way to end this debate than a word on how to civilly fight with our relatives, so thank you for that. And thank you to the rest of our debaters tonight. We hope you enjoyed this evening. To our audience members who tuned in, please continue to follow the Brookings and Charles Koch Institute series throughout the rest of the year. And we welcome your feedback on Twitter on how tonight went using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld. From Dallas, thank you all and good night.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.